Gives me absolute great pleasure to be here this afternoon to give you some insight to, I guess, the last 2 weeks of my life and four lucky students' lives. If today was sponsored by Emirates, there would be definitely more legroom. We've been through a phenomenal experience in a very, very congested block of time. There was a huge process leading up to Gallipoli. But my job today is to report that the journey was incredibly successful. The 4 students that were chosen by the school were absolutely brilliant ambassadors for themselves, for their families, for our school definitely. Our reputation has grown enormously for the state of New South Wales and for Australia. The experience we went through was very moving. It was incredibly highly packed with emotional moments. Every moment of every day was just one experience after the other. Collectively, we've taken thousands of photos, and what I've done is to limit the kids today to 3 or 4 images to try and encapsulate what the whole experience means to them. So unless I forget at the end, I really would like to have you congratulate our 4 students on a tremendous effort on their behalf in Cronulla High. A lady in the fruit shop this week met me, and she's a parent of an ex-student of ours, and she made the mistake of asking me, how was the trip? And 25 minutes later, then she was looking at a watch frantically to say she had other things to do. It's impossible to sum up what we've been through in a short period of time, and in some respects this assembly would need to be 5 times longer if we were to give you the complete summary of everything we've been through. We went there with the intentions to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of what most people would argue was the first and most significant event for a newly emerging nation of Australia to start and build our national culture and our international reputation. Now, you would have heard stories of Anzac since kindergarten, and you are a part of the generation where Anzac is growing in reputation every year. Through primary school, you would have heard Anzac stories and learned about Simpson, Donkey and all those other things. For me, at my stage of life, it was just phenomenal to be able to go and stand where all these stories have started from, and to get some sense of the national pride, the national work ethic, and our national culture. It was great that it was in Turkey, because the Turkish people were incredibly accommodating of Australians, and still are. If they find out you're Australian, then they're very, very proud to have you there. There's an incredible bond between the 2 countries that will only grow in the future, and Turkey, I think, has an incredibly important role to play in possibly bringing some sensibility to the whole Middle East issues at the moment. And I think when you see on every car ferry and all their publicity, they have one expression that says, peace is possible. And I'm sure that's the Turkish mantra at the moment, and that's what separates them from a lot of other Islamic countries at the moment in their neck of the woods. So my attempt to grab a few images to tell you some of my experiences. Some of these, obviously most of these are photos, but I've embellished it by adding a few other things to hopefully go from there. The starting point. This is us. Prior to leaving, I hadn't taught Sydney or Jazz Marie. I introduced myself to Sydney Soames this year, and we knew that we hadn't spoken to each other for the previous 3 years. These are great representatives of your school. Each has their own attributes, their own strengths, and each of them grew inordinately throughout the whole journey. They were a standout in terms of how they achieved and worked in a group of 100 students across a really broad cross-section of schools, from the wealthiest private schools in Sydney to the largest public schools in Sydney to the smallest country schools. We had situations where a boy from a small country town was lucky enough to be chosen, and his twin brother, missed out. All these amazing stories, but our kids were just standouts and made me so proud on every given day. In some ways, this is my go-to photo. This to me encapsulates so much of what we're on about. Here we have a 600-year-old fort, which is 3 times as long as European and non-Indigenous Australia has even existed. England were bombed from this fort with their navy in World War I, and the English Navy deliberately chose not to destroy this with their guns off their ships. We only wish today that ISIS would make some similar judgments in regard to World Heritage listed icons. This told me that this is a really troublesome part of the world. You can see an inflatable like that on Sydney Harbour, you can see it on Port Hacking with the water police, or people are lucky enough to have a boat like this. But to have a 50 calibre machine gun stuck out the front of it really told me that this is a political bombshell waiting to go off. And it made me think that I really hoped that the security was going to be first rate. I think we would have been a great target in terms of terrorist minds, but the amount of weaponry that I saw really let me know that the Turkish military and the Australian military collectively had it all worked out. After a 5-hour bus trip, after a 20-odd hour plane trip, after 12 hours at Sydney Airport, this is us stepping onto the landing beach where all the stories of World War I come from. The red seats in the background is where the dawn service occurred, and behind that, that's exactly as sunrise occurred on Anzac Day 2015. That's the site that Australian and New Zealand soldiers faced for the next 8 months. And that says so much to me. This is a post-World War I painting done to try and give us some notion about what it would have been like. But it really fills my heart with pride to think that I've been there and stood on the same beaches, and it reinforces a lot of my beliefs about Australia. The thing I couldn't get my head around was just how many people would have been in a small space. Gallipoli, the whole fighting area is really tiny, and this post-World War I painting tries to gauge just how packed it would have been. And same with the photo, because that's a road off the beach, and we've walked that road and we've been all over it. And these images and paintings, this is what, as a child, I was brought up with for Gallipoli, so it's been in my head for 50 years or more, and it's fantastic to go and reference that against reality. With the famous Sphinx in the background, this is dawn service. 10,000 people there made a hell of a lot more noise than 800 people in this hall just a few minutes ago. This was so quiet an event. You could hear the water lapping on the beach, you could hear the birds in the trees. 10,000 people completely respectful of the process. Every one of us lucky enough to be there by draw. All of us had, forget what Willy Wonka said about the prize winning ticket, this is what will stick on my wall forever, and I know there's only a tiny number of Australians who have the luxury of that ticket. On our tour we had a Turkish-speaking tour guide, Rabia, who did a great job to infill us with Turkish history, Turkish culture, Turkish traditions, and also Tony on the left, sorry, James on the left, he's our military expert. So at any point we had just a tremendous infill of knowledge. Possibly the most photographed grave in all of the Gallipoli Peninsula is the Simpson from Simpson's Donkey. So many people would photograph this, so many people think this is an iconic Australian story. In reality, he's an English person. He died, as you may be able to see, at 22 years old. He survived on Anzac for 3.5 weeks, 25 days. So the whole myth and the whole story was built in just a few days. And that's his grave. This is a rare photograph, but an actual photograph of Simpson and his donkey. A young man who found a way to get from Australia back to England and didn't quite make it. For me, I guess the biggest moment was when an old lady rang me up to say could I find a copy of the grave for her to take a photograph. So a lady I've never met asked me to find a photograph of a headstone of a man she had never met. And it just so happened this was her late father's best mate. He also survived only a few weeks, and it was our challenge to find that headstone at Lone Pine, photograph it, and I'll take that to that lady, and that will complete a whole circle in her life. As well as the military side of things, as well as Anzac, we had a phenomenal cultural experience. So this is inside the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, the largest city in Turkey. This is a 500 or 600 year old building. This is a practicing mosque. You can see people in the background praying. This has about 10,000 visitors per day, so about 3 to 4 million people a year pass through this building. Absolutely amazing, and we only went there for the Anzac experience, but all this other cultural stuff was just brilliant. This is an ironic photo. This is one I snapped out of the last window of the last hotel we stayed in, probably an hour before flying home. And weirdly enough, it's nothing sinister, but in my mind, before I went, I was so concerned about the safety of the 4 kids that I was put in charge with. And I've had a whole lifetime of looking at fighting in the Middle East, that this image was what I perceived the risk to be. And I just thought it weirdly ironic and completely encapsulating for me that the last thing I saw in Turkey was the thing I feared the most. Innocently, it's nothing more than, you know, something being burned on the harbour, but I just thought it's weird that I looked out the window at that time. It was 10 seconds before I went down to the bus, but it just completed my circle, my journey. And lastly, I think this is an actual photo of the war. I think this is the neck, a tiny part of the Gallipoli Peninsula, and I think the Australian spirit is built on mateship. We don't know who the people are, we never will know who the people are, but I thought, wouldn't it be nice if one of those people was the man I went to find in the headstone. We'll never know, but I'll keep that in my mind forever. Thank you.